Affton, Missouri. We're not sure if we got that through, so good morning. If you didn't hear it the first time, welcome to Bible study here at Salem Lutheran Church in Affton, Missouri. My name is Brett Jones. I am the second-year seminarian, and I am a field worker here at Salem, and it is my pleasure to begin this 5-week study with you. Again, if you have any questions, please type them in the comments section. Mr. Whitmire and Peter Frank are here. They will be looking at the questions, and they will let me know if you have them, and then we can answer those questions and discuss any possible answers that I may have, and that'll also help with our discussion today. All right. With that being said, let's begin. If you could please advance to the format slide, Mr. Frank, I would appreciate it. So we have a 5-week course, and each week we're going to do several things. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to go over a brief biography of who wrote the particular gospel that we're going to be studying that day. Today it will be St. Mark, and then we're going to go to Matthew next week, Luke, John, and then the 5th week we're going to talk about what are called the Gnostic Gospels. So that's going to be something to look forward to as well. We're going to talk about who the intended audience for that particular book is and how that affects what's written in the book. And then we're going to walk through the resurrection account of that book. What we're going to do is we're actually going to read it together, and then we are going to discuss some things that are particular to that gospel account. And then we're going to talk about how that affects us as Christians. So that's going to be our general format. Our agenda for today is to first kind of talk about how history is written today versus how it was written in the first century. This may not be something you think about on a regular basis, but the method by which history is written has really changed over the course of 2,000 years, and this can impact how we read texts that aren't written in a modern context. We're going to talk about what the Synoptic Gospels are, and then we're going to look at St. Mark's Gospel in general, and then his account of the resurrection specifically. So, first, let's talk about history in general. So if you could please advance to the couple slides there. It's perfect. So if you don't know, before I left to go to the seminary, my previous job was a Lutheran school teacher. So this textbook on the left is one that I've actually taught out of. One of the classes that I taught was world history along with American history, and the one on the right is one that we ordered right before I left my previous church. And just as a side note, I would have loved to be a fly on the wall in the conversation about the picture on the front of that textbook, because they decided that it would be great for students to look down the business end of a canon at the beginning of every history class, and I would have loved to hear the rationale for that. But that's really aside. But what do you think about when you see a textbook? So a textbook is organized into chapters, and each chapter is organized into lessons, and each lesson has a heading, okay? And underneath that heading, it will just discuss facts. So a textbook is really trying to tell you an objective retelling of what happened. Now, we all know that these objective retellings in a history book are not necessarily objective. After all, there is usually a panel of 4 or 5 historians who will decide what gets included and what gets left out of a history book. After all, it's only a textbook. It's probably only 2 or 3 inches thick, and you have to cover the entirety of human civilization within those pages. So something is going to get left out. From what perspective is that going to be told? I would wager that if you grabbed a history book from the United States and grabbed a history book from China, that they would look a little bit different, right? Because the perspectives are quite different. And to illustrate this, let's think about the content of the Revolutionary War. If we were to look at the chapter in this textbook on the Revolutionary War, it would probably discuss it as a war started to gain independence and freedom. I would wager that if you got a British textbook, the War of Independence would not be portrayed in a similar manner. And this goes to what I like to call the veil of authenticity. Okay, these things are written in a language that only talks about facts and therefore makes it seem like this is the account of history. You can think of like a Ken Burns documentary. What do you see in a Ken Burns documentary? You see a bunch of pictures and one narrator just laying out the way it happened. And that's sort of what we think about when we think of a textbook. And also, they focus on the order of time. Okay, most textbooks are written in chronological order. And when we think about history, we think about dates. We think about 1862, 1865, 1945 when World War II ended, 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed. We think about things in chronological order. And lastly, we think there's a tremendous amount of volume of history today. Okay, you can look at the History Channel, you can go down to Barnes & Noble, you can peruse the virtual shelves on Amazon, and there are thousands of books written about history. Okay, even if you want to take a topic like the Civil War, you could fill a library on just books about the Civil War. This was not true in the first century. If you could please change the slide. History was taught in a very different manner back then. Oral history was much more common than written history, since most people were illiterate. You could only generally read if you were in the upper class or had specialized training. And even written materials were expensive. It's not like you could go down to Micro Center and get your $1.99 ream of paper. Papyrus or leather were all very expensive and time-consuming to prepare. We really have it lucky today where we can just get on our computer and type something out and print it out and hand it. That was just not possible. And also, but this is the most important part, and that history was written with a purpose. History was not just written to tell a story. It was written to accomplish a goal. And this is still true of our history today. Now you think about those textbooks and who's writing it, what gets included, what the order is, okay? But they were much more explicit about accomplishing a goal with the gospel, with the written accounts. And we're going to see this as we go through the different accounts. We're going to see different emphases. We're going to see different ways that Jesus is portrayed. All of this because these books were written with a specific purpose in mind. And last, and this is also important, in that order of time was not nearly as important as it was then, as it is now, because the accounts were written with a purpose in mind, they didn't really think about the order of time. Okay, so we're going to come back to this example in a moment, but think about if you take a group of friends to a Cardinal game, okay? Or if you were to get five people that go as a group to a Cardinal game, and you ask them to tell you what happened, they're probably not going to tell you all of the events in exactly the same order. And that's okay. That doesn't make any of the accounts untrue. It just means that they're being told from a different perspective. Okay, and this is what's going to lead us into our discussion of these synoptic gospels. Okay, these synoptic gospels literally is from a Greek word that means seeing all together. Okay, the Greek word is synoptikos. It's on the slide there if you want to take a look at it. And this is really, we're not going to get deep into Greek today. This is a casual Bible study, so really the only thing that you need to know is that the word synoptic comes from a Greek word that means seeing all together. Okay, and the synoptic gospels are Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So all three of these gospels are written in a similar manner. They are similar in their narratives, they are similar in their sequence, and they are similar in their wording. That doesn't mean that they are identical, but that they largely line up. So let's go back to our example at a Cardinal game. Okay, so you've got 5 or 6 friends who all go to a Cardinal game, or a Cub game, because Vicar Brian is standing over here behind us. You'd really want to go to the Cardinal game, though. So after the Cardinal game, you may have someone who was very intense on watching the pitching of the game. You may have someone who is focusing in on the hitting. And you may have a couple of people who aren't really watching the game at all. They're more interested in seeing what's going on in the stands. And if you're like my kids when they go to the game, they're really interested in the food. Now, so if you get all of those people together and you ask them, what happened at the game? You're going to get similar answers, but different perspectives. You're going to get someone who talks about, oh man, the pitching was really good today. You're going to have someone who also said, the hitting was really good today, because it's a Cardinal game, so the pitching and the hitting is going to be good. Okay? And you may have someone who said, the game was all right, but I really enjoyed the food. And that's okay. It doesn't make any of the different perspectives invalid. But what it does give you is it actually gives you a more complete picture of what's going on in the game. And the same is true with the Synoptic Gospels. We don't want to think of them as Matthew just going in his direction, Mark going in his direction, and Luke going in his direction. What we want to do is we want to take those and take what each of those offer to us and give that and allow that to give us a better picture of what happened at the resurrection. Okay, so with that in mind, let's take a look at a brief discussion of who St. Mark was. St. Mark was John Mark in the book of Acts. So if you read the book of Acts, even though Luke wrote the book of Acts, you will see Mark referred to in there. Okay, he was the son of Mary of Jerusalem. That's from Acts 12. And Mary was a Christian woman who opened her home as a meeting place for the early apostles as they were beginning to go on their missionary journeys. He was the cousin of Barnabas. Okay, he was from Cyrus, and he was a Jew. And it seems that Peter knew his family. So there is a lot of familiarity with Mark within the early Christians. Okay, but this, unlike some other authors like Luke or John or Paul, St. Mark only has one book written in his name. If you could please advance the slide. Some of the work that Mark did when he was working with the other early Christian apostles, he went with Paul and Barnabas on the first missionary journey. That's in Acts 13. He had a disagreement over Mark, that led Paul and Barnabas to part ways. But we know that at some point he and Paul reconciled because he was with Paul in his first Roman imprisonment, and that's in Philemon. Okay, and then Mark was with Peter in Rome when he wrote his first gospel. Now, this particular item doesn't come from the Bible itself. This comes from church tradition, from a man named Papias, who was one of the early apostolic fathers, and he was a Greek apostolic father. We come later to 2 Timothy, where Paul urges Timothy to bring Mark to him in his last imprisonment. And according to tradition, Mark was the founder of the church in Alexandria in Egypt and its first bishop. So as you can see, Mark has quite a bit of missionary background and was attached with many of the early apostles. So that's a little bit about history in general. That's a little bit about the Synoptic Gospels, and that's a little bit about St. Mark in particular. Are there any questions so far? So now seems like a decent time to take a break and for me to take a sip of coffee as we... No? Okay. Well, then let's move on to the Gospel of Mark. So the Gospel of Mark was written in the second half of the first century. There's a little bit of disagreement as to the date, but generally it's estimated anywhere between 60 and 80 AD. He wrote it in Rome at the request of the people who heard Peter preach there. So this is again according to tradition that this book was written for a Roman audience, and that will tell you that these people were Gentiles. If you remember the distinction between Jews and Gentiles, the Jews are the descendants of the line of Abraham, and the Gentiles are everybody else. So you and I are Gentiles, and you can see the various ways that Mark wrote his book in a way that was accessible to this audience. So if you look on the bottom of the slide, it'll have the various specific ways that he did this. So he explained various Hebrew and Aramaic expressions. So if you've ever talked to somebody who's learned a second or third language, this is generally one of the hardest things for them to understand. It's not, so if we're having a literal conversation with somebody, that's pretty easy to figure out. But once you start throwing in various phrases and idioms that are specific to that culture, a foreign language learner can get lost. So Mark made sure that he included what some of those Hebrew and Aramaic expressions meant so that the Gentiles who were reading the books would be familiar with them. He had to do the same thing for Jewish customs. Imagine for a second that you were an alien descending upon the earth and you landed right here at Christmas. And what would that mean? When we look in the sanctuary here at Salem, we all know what the trees in the chancel mean. We know why the wreaths are there. We know why the lights are strung throughout the church. But if you had no exposure to any of that tradition before, those things would be completely unclear. You'd start to wonder, why are there trees in this place? Why do those trees have lights on them? Why do they have shiny little red and gold balls on them? Why are there other little piney looking things hanging throughout the sanctuary? And why are these weird lights strung all over the place? Okay? Those are things that if we're not familiar with a culture, they need to be explained. And Mark did that in his gospel. He also only quoted the Old Testament once. We'll see later that one of the other gospels was written to a Jewish audience, and he made all sorts of connections to the Old Testament. But Mark's assumption would have been that these Gentiles really aren't familiar with the Old Testament prophecies, so those aren't where he puts his emphasis. Rather, he's going to put his emphasis on what's going on right now. The next one is that he converts the value of Greek currency to Roman. So that allows them to think about any kind of story that involves money in their own terms. You'll see this if you ever watch a news report from a foreign country, right? So if you ever see a British news report. So if you know me, you know that I have sometimes I get my news from the BBC, and they'll have a story that involves some sort of amount of money, and it's always in British pounds with the dollars behind it. Why? Because that's written for a British audience first. Okay, whereas if you're going to read the same news story here, that amount will be converted into dollars. So and the reverse is true too. If they are writing a story based upon something that's happening here, they're going to convert dollars into pounds, just so that we have a common frame of reference. So Mark wanted to make sure that anyone who was reading this book could easily interpret what was going on when there was money involved. And finally, there are a couple of times where he takes an unfamiliar Greek term and converts it into a Latin term. Now, there would have been many people who may have known some Greek, but but it would not have been the primary language. The primary language the official language of the Roman Empire was not Greek, it was Latin. So that would have been the language that most of these people would have known first. And so Greek there would have been several, just like if you have a second or third language, there are going to be some words you know and some that are unfamiliar to you, that are less common. So those words were converted in Mark's gospel. If you could advance the slide, please. The style of the gospel speaks to that Roman audience. Okay, he writes it in an action-oriented style. This was not always a Jesus who sat around and contemplated things. No, the Jesus portrayed in Matthew's gospel is a man of action. He is a man who does. Okay, and they emphasize the deeds of Jesus. And that spoke to the Roman culture of the time, which is not to say that the words of Jesus were unimportant. They certainly were. But they wanted to put an emphasis on what he did, because that was what the culture around them was expecting. So as you look at how Jesus is portrayed, he is portrayed as strong. He is portrayed as a man of authority who can command attention. He is portrayed as a man of power who is able to do miraculous things. He is portrayed as a man to be feared, not in the sense of being afraid of, but in the sense of being respected. You think about the old phrases where you fear your parents. Okay, you don't necessarily tremble in fear against your parents, but you do know that they have authority and that they have power. And of course, he was portrayed as divine and fully human. So, that's how Jesus was portrayed. The plot itself is not given with chronology. Remember, this is much different from how we think about history today. It is given rather as a plot with a strong sense of urgency. Jesus is always acting and finding things that he takes care of. So are there any questions so far? No? All right. Well, either that means it's going really well or it's going really terribly, and I hope that it's the first. So let's continue on with reading the resurrection account together. So this is going to come from the English Standard Version, which is the version that we use in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. But if you have a different version at home and the words are slightly different, don't worry about it. All of our major English translations are quite reliable. So let's read together. When the Sabbath was past, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome brought spices, so that they might go and anoint him. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. And they were saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone from us from the entrance of the tomb?" And looking up, they saw that the stone had been rolled back. It was very large. And entering the tomb, they saw a young man sitting on the right side, dressed in a white robe, and they were alarmed. And he said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go and tell his disciples and Peter that he is going before you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." And they went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. So, if you're looking at a paper Bible right now, you're probably looking at the first thing that we're going to talk about as being distinctive, as there's a little note right next to it that tells you that everything after verse 8 wasn't in all of the early manuscripts. And we'll talk about this in more detail in just a second. But if you could please advance the slide, Mr. Frank. Thank you. Mark's account, and these are Pastor Huebner's words when he and I met, is that it's kind of like a season finale. You end up at verse 8, and there's all sorts of things going on, and no one's quite sure what's going to happen then. To reveal just about how nerdy I am, the season finale that always comes to mind was in Star Trek: The Next Generation, when Captain Picard had been assimilated by the Borg, and he was just about to encounter the Enterprise, and Will Riker says fire, and the screen goes black. You don't know what's going to happen. And we kind of get the same feeling here. Most scholars believe that verse 8 is really the authentic ending of the book, that what was appended on was added at a later date, and we'll talk a little more in specifics about that in a second, but I just want to take a look at this quote, because at the verse 8, and this is from a quote from R.T. France in his commentary on the Greek text, is that the appearance of the risen Jesus, announced but not narrated, and the central message of the Christian gospel entrusted to a group of demoralized women who were afraid to say anything about it. Wow. If you could please advance the slide. We have all of the pieces of the story are there, but it's up to the reader to make the conclusion. What is going to happen next? We have another quote, this from the same commentary. Against that catastrophe, which is the crucifixion, the epilogue provides hardly an adequate closure from the book, and that is precisely the point. The ironies in Mark have left the reader with a deep sense that more is going on here than meets the eye, that this story, including its catastrophe, is meaningful in a dimension not readily available on the surface. The reader is forced back into the book again. Wouldn't that be a great thing if you reach the end of a gospel and say, maybe I should read that again, and again, and again. In one of our homiletical classes, Dr. Gibbs always says, we're going to read this text, and we're going to read it 4 times. We're not just going to read it once. We're going to read it 4 times in class, after we had read it before class, because every time you read something over, you see new details. You see things you hadn't previously seen. And this may be one of the purposes of the end of this gospel, to force you back into Mark, to read it again, and see what you missed the first time. If you could advance the slide, please. And this poses a question that has been asked ever since the gospel was first written. Can you still be a Christian if you only had Mark 16, verses 1 through 8? If you didn't have the ending narrated for you, can you still be a Christian? Give you a second to ponder that. Now, lest there be any surprise at the answer you're going to get, the answer is, of course, yes, you can still be a Christian with only Mark 16, verses 1 through 8. Okay? This is not the season finale that leaves you in distress because you know that nothing will ever end. This is a season finale that you know will pick up and will come to a conclusion that is satisfactory for the reader. Is there a question?
Yes, we have a question from Sherry, who asks, how are all of these books, scrolls kept together? Were there copies dispersed to other safe places? Because of Roman dissension, were these documents kept secure, hidden?
Yes and no. They were not always hidden, and we're going to get a little bit out of my really zone of expertise, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I know, and then if you'd like me to do a little more research on this and come back to it, I would be happy to. These These were not originally written as books like a Bible like you would imagine today. These were written as individual letters that were dispersed amongst the different churches throughout the area. So after this would have been written in Rome, it would have been copied there and then sent to the other churches. So there was never really one essential copy that if it were destroyed by the Romans, that would have led to the complete loss of the gospel. There were generally copies all around. Many of those have been recovered, and they are housed. Actually, I can't tell you where they're housed right now because I do not know. But they are being kept safe in. There's a bunch of these in Israel. There are some that are being kept safe in other places as well. Does that answer your question? Okay, I hope so. Sorry, I'm used to you all being right here, so I can usually say, does that answer your question? And you can either nod yes or nod no, but we're going, but, so. Also about a 20-second delay, too. Oh, yes, well, there's a 20-second, okay. So, Sherry, I hope that answers your question, and if you have any follow-ups, please let me know, and I'd be happy to take a look at it throughout the week and get back to you next Sunday. So, Mr. Frank, if you could please advance the slide, we will return to why it's so important that we can be a Christian with only Mark 16, verses 1 through 8. And here are a few reasons. First, none of the Gospels directly describe Jesus' rising. In every single one, they come to the empty tomb. They come and Jesus has already risen. Okay? All of them, and in all of the accounts, when they get there, there is someone there telling them that Jesus had risen. And all of them assume that the very act of Jesus rising from the dead happened sometime prior to the women coming to the tomb. So yes, we can still be Christians with only Mark. Now, it makes it much easier for us as Christians to know the rest of the story, as Paul Harvey would always say. He'd always give you a line at the beginning and then saying, actually, here's what's going on behind the scenes. And that's one of the reasons we can be thankful for our possession of the other Gospels, because they do fill in those details, sort of like going back to the example at the Cardinal game where all the different perspectives fill in the picture and make it complete. All right, so let's talk about that verses 9 through 20, and then so we've got two really things left to do. We're going to walk through those verses 9 through 20, and then we're going to go back to the actual account in Mark and look at a couple verses in detail. So let's look at this what was added to the end of Mark. Now, nothing is certain as to whether this was actually included, but the general consensus is that this is not originally part of what Mark wrote. The account it looks like it is a summary of what is in the other Gospels, and that it was likely added by someone later in the early church. And if you want to go back to that sort of season finale sort of analogy, this would have been the season premiere that would have filled in those details. So that's really what's going on here in these last verses. But what's really important to note is that this does not undermine what we think about as Scripture. It's just an addition that is taken from the other Gospels. Mr. Whitmere, is there a question?
I have a question, and
okay.
then there's also a comment. So how much later would have that, are there indications how much later that would have been added?
I do not know the answer to that question. I will take a look at that and see if I can find it.
I mean, and is that one of those things, again, is it like, okay, so the rest of the Gospels have come out and, they're all talking about what happened after Jesus rose. We need to put that onto Mark too?
I don't know that I would think about it like that. I think I would think about it more in the sense of many in the early church wanted to make it easy to be a Christian, and this is a way to do that. It's a way to fill in the gaps that were left by Mark. So, Mark sort of leaves it up to you and to figure out what's going on. And many in the early church thought that was an unsatisfactory answer. And this has been a debate that's been raging on for millennia, and it's actually still going right now. If you want to, so CPH is in the middle of writing these giant Concordia commentaries, and Dr. Veltz, who is writing the commentary on Mark, actually refused to write anything about verses 9 through 20. They had to go hire somebody else to do it. So this debate is still going on, but what's important to know is that you can still trust what's on the pages, and that's really what we need to be concerned with. Is that a satisfactory answer?
Great, thanks.
Okay.
There's a comment, too, from our history expert in the Bible class, Art, who talks about Greek. And he says, upper-class Romans since the time of the late Republic, 100 BC, would have been fluent in Greek. Tiberius, in a speech before the Senate, apologizes for using the Greek word monopoly because there was no equivalent term in Latin. At the time of its initial publication, who would have been reading it? I'm assuming he's talking about Mark, and he appreciated the next generation reference.
Oh. Well, I'm glad somebody else does, and it's not just complete nonsense to everyone. This was initially written to people who were being preached at in the Roman Church, so that would have been the first readers for this. Did I get the question right?
I think so. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Again, Art, thank you. I'm glad you're here virtually. We missed your commentary when we're in person, and we appreciate that you're here. So, if you could please advance the slide, Mr. Frank. We're going to talk about three verses and what's going on with them. You'll see the verse on the right-hand side of the slide, and then we'll talk about what's going on the left hand of the slide. So, the thing that I want to talk about in verse 5 is that they saw a young man. Mark is the only gospel that lists the person in the tomb as a young man. And this has been used by various people who want to knock down the resurrection account as being not accurate, because they say, well, the other ones say that he's an angel. Why does this one say that he's a young man? That doesn't make any sense. But I think you can make a really strong case, and I certainly believe that when they were referring to the young man, that they are referring to an angel. So we'll walk through that case together right now. So, first of all, the other Gospels do list the young man as an angel. Their reaction to him is much more consistent with a supernatural encounter than finding an ordinary man. Now, you would certainly be alarmed if you found someone in a grave, right? I think I would be. But if you look at the conversation that takes place afterward, there's a certain pattern where people in the Bible encounter supernatural beings, whether it's God or angels, and one of the first things they always say is, do not be afraid or do not be alarmed. So the kind of pattern of conversation and the reaction that they have with him is consistent with encountering an angel rather than just a man. There are other writings, both in Luke and Acts, and also from the Apocrypha, that sometimes use a similar expression for an angel. There's one in Luke 24, there's one in Acts 1, one in Acts 10, and there's one in the Apocrypha that all refer to an angel as a young man. And I already kind of discussed shortly, the do not be alarmed is a really common feature of angelic appearances. Well, that's the first thing that they tell them. You want to think about even the Annunciation where the angel appears to Mary. What's the first thing the angel says to Mary? Do not be afraid. So in do not be afraid is very common for an angelic appearance. And finally, the young man, when he's sitting at the right side, that was the position that one would speak from if they were going to be teaching and had authority. So this is not just a common person sitting there. This was an angel. Yes, John.
So, Brett, by Mark using the term young man, he would have assumed that his audience would have known that this was an angel.
I think that's a reasonable assumption. I don't think I'm in a position 2,000 years without actually interviewing him to say that is the case, but I think that's a reasonable assumption, and I think that is what he intended.
What he intended.
Yes.
Why do you think he used the term young? I mean, was that enough of a clue that it was an angel, or why did he use young man? Why didn't he?
That's an excellent question. I would postulate that would be enough for him, for the audience to understand what's going on, but I do not know precisely the answer to that question. So I do apologize for continuing to say, I'm not sure. So that being verse 5, let's quickly skip to verse 7 as we are kind of rapidly running out of time here. The verse 7 is, "But go tell his disciples and Peter that he is going before you to Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you." Now, this is an important verse because that first phrase, "go tell his disciples," that's not just information. Okay, that's a call to action. The angel is telling them, this story is not over. There is more that is going to occur. And even though Mark doesn't specifically tell you what's going to happen next, he is letting you know through literary signals that this is not the end of the story. There will be more that is told. And then the next part, "and Peter." Now, this revolves around Peter's desertion of Jesus. If you remember, right before his crucifixion, Peter denied Jesus. And it's possible, we don't know this for sure, that it is possible that he was separated from the other disciples now. So that's something that people have thought. We don't know for sure. But it could also be referring to simply the message of forgiveness and reconciliation and restoration to Peter. So it could be a physical separation. It could be just simply to tell him, make sure you tell Peter because he is forgiven. Yes?
Okay, I have a question from Don, who texted it in, actually. He says, "If I understand you correctly, when looking at all four Gospels, they report the birth, death, and resurrection of Jesus differently. This can make the Gospels credible due to that fact. All of the events did happen, but from a different perspective. Is that correct?"
Yes, I believe that you are stating, yes, that sounds right. Yes. Yes, that they are, and we'll get into more about how this affects the writing. It'll start to become clearer as we continue to do this. And you're just going to have to trust me on this, that you will begin to see differences, especially as we go into Matthew next week, as Matthew is written for a more Jewish audience. So you're going to see a lot of contrast with the style of this gospel next week. So yes, stay tuned. All of the different perspectives, one of the great things about the Gospels is that they don't end up contradicting each other. They end up filling in some of the different pieces to give us a more complete picture of what had happened. So let's talk briefly about verse 7. I see that we have just under 5 minutes left, and then we want to move on to verse 8, and then I'll take any more questions, and then it'll be time for us to be done together. So let's move on to the last part. There you will see him just as he told you. And this will lead us into one of the other Gospels, and this will be in Luke later on. So this particular detail is filled in by another gospel. So Mr. Frank, if you could please advance the slide to our final slide. And let's take a look at verse 8. And they went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. This is another one of those verses where people who are trying to discredit the resurrection account say, wait, this ends with them being afraid and then not telling anyone, but the other gospels say that they went and told people. So how do we reconcile this? Well, let's first take a look at the trembling and astonishment that had seized them. The Greek word for this is ekstasis, which the definition there is a profound emotional experience to the point of being beside oneself, but this is the root word for ecstasy. So our word that we commonly think of, that we know as ecstasy, comes from this Greek word. So there is a sense that this is not just fear, that they know that something good is happening here. And there's a feeling of awe, and not awesome like the word has been kind of destroyed in the 90s, but really the traditional meaning of the word awesome, that it is something that is almost unbelievable. And then finally they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. This was not a permanent silence. Okay? But think about, put yourself in the women's place for just a second. What could happen to them? What had just happened to Jesus for spreading his message? This is not something that they would immediately shout to the world for fear of immediate retribution. They were going to go tell the disciples. So this was not going to be something that was permanently silent. They are not going to tell anyone until they reach the disciples. Plus, they were still processing what they had just seen. Have you ever had a time where you experienced something profound and you just had to take a moment to figure it all out? I know I certainly have. But this is certainly one of those times where the women at the tomb probably just had to take a moment and process what had just happened. Because this is not something that occurs every day. You don't walk into a tomb ready to prepare a body and encounter an angel. So this is something that would have been quite the experience for them, as it would be for us. So the end of the matter being that they were not silent forever, but only for a little bit, until they went and told the disciples, as we know from the other Gospels, which we'll get into more next week. So, are there any final questions before we end with prayer today? Okay. If you would please pray with me. Heavenly Father, we give you thanks for everything that you have provided for us. We give you thanks for the day you've given us today. We give you thanks for the ability to gather virtually to study your word, and we give you thanks for the message contained in your word. We give you thanks for all the disciples who wrote and distributed that word, and we give you thanks for your work of the Holy Spirit, that it can still bring us to faith over 2 millennia later. Be with us today as we either gather for worship or continue about our day, that everything we do may be to your glory and bring us closer to you. In your name we pray. Amen. Thank you very much for joining us for our Bible study today. Next week we will take a look at Matthew in our 5-week series. We hope you'll join us again next week. God's blessings on your day.